So, welcome to Tech Tots, episode 2, and a really good chance to introduce Tori, one of the team at Tandem and Early Ideas. Tori is an expert in early child development by virtue of being a mum, but also having worked for a long time in child charities for much of her career. She's also the head of marketing at Early Ideas. We're going to have an interview today where we're talking about really the science bit of early childhood and why early childhood is so important. And then within that, we'll touch on bits around kind of technology in early childhood, but it's really about why do we care about young kids? So over to you, Tori.
Yeah, so today, as Rob said, we're going to talk about the early years, why they matter, what parents can do practically, and then we'll end on some quick fire questions about early childhood.
Go.
So I thought I'd start off with actually what we hear the term like early childhood and early years a lot. So what are we actually talking about there?
Yeah, I mean, one of the funny things, and it's a bit silly, but lots of people disagree on what we mean by the early years, and it can be a bit different terms. From my point of view and how we're thinking about it in building Tandem is broadly that period before school, so the period before kids start school. Now, within that, there's definitely there's different sort of traditions of how you think about it. If you come from the health world, people often talk about the first 1,000 days, and actually they start their 1,000 days from conception, so it's pregnancy, and the first 2 years of life, and we say that's the 1,000 days that really set the trend for children. The reason we do that has been largely grown out of the sort of child malnutrition world, where we've got quite good data that shows if you're malnourished at that age, it's not that you can't catch up, but it's a bit harder. So there's a big focus on the 1,000 days there. In countries like the UK and the US, there's another movement called the First 1,000 Days movement, which thinks about 1,000 days starting at birth. So that gets you sort of roughly 3 years in, a bit less. Mm-hmm. But if you come from an education background, people tend to think of early childhood or early childhood education as the period, the preschool years. So it tends to be sort of 3, 4, 5. Mm-hmm. And there's really interesting reasons why, as I say, the medics like myself tend to come from that kind of looking at things they can measure around growth and malnutrition. The educationalists start a bit more in the later and sort of down age from there. And for us, we're thinking about this as that whole period in the early years, basically because it does set that trajectory. But it's not just the sort of biomedical, it's also that social emotional, the interaction, the periods when we're kind of forming our sense of self. So yeah, different years, but depending on who you talk to, anywhere between the first 2 years of life or first 2.5 years of life up to the first 7 years of life, really roughly.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I've heard it referred to as up to the first 7, which is, interesting from that developmental point of view. So with that, I've also, a lot as a parent about, those early years are absolutely crucial for development. But can you sort of break down the science a little bit on that? So what's happening and why is that so pivotal?
Yeah, a really good question. I think we sort of all intuitively know it. If you've met a baby or you've met a toddler, you can see the pace at which they're picking up skills, and you can sort of learn, you get a sense of it. But actually we've got really good science in the last few years that have both shown what the mechanisms involved there are, and also the kind of observational research that shows what happens if you have kind of what we call early childhood adversity in the early years. So in terms of what's actually happening, the early years are really when our brains are absolutely on fire. We are forming neuronal connections and our brains are growing faster than it. In the early years, children's brain development is really just faster than any other time in our lives. By age 5, we've got 90% of the volume of brain that we're ever going to have. Mm-hmm. Grows a little bit more in the later years, and there's some fascinating stuff that happens to our brains again in adolescence, particularly, is another period of really important change. But those early years are if you could pick one period in the life course, it's the early years. And what's happening in that is both neuronal connections. So we've got some fascinating kind of neuroimaging nowadays that can show the pace and change that's happening in how our brain is basically being wired up, how the different parts that control language, that control motor, that control our emotions, how these are all starting to get connected. And it happens it's incredibly complicated, but it happens with lots of connections, but then also a sort of pruning of those connections to make the important main roads and arterial routes and get rid of some of the sort of side routes and make our brains work more kind of efficiently. So yeah, in the early years we have this incredible period of brain growth is the main kind of headline. The other thing is that's the period when we start to form a sense of self and a sense of who we are, and we start to realize that when a baby's born, they have they start really from in utero to form incredible connections to their mother. After birth, those connections hopefully will continue and get stronger with other kind of very close caregivers, the mother, the father, others around them. But what also happens in the early years is we move towards understanding other people around us and learning kind of how to interact with people. So it's the real foundations of the social emotional learning as well as the sort of hard science, as it were.
Mm-hmm. So I remember actually when I first had my son, there was a book called The Wonder Years. And I suppose a question actually I get a lot from other parents is, do those sort of developmental stages continue? Because that very much covers like those first 1,000 days, I think it was, like that development. So I suppose it's interesting as a parent, do those like sort of developmental upgrades or sections continue in a similar fashion up to 7, or is that sort of slightly less clear?
I mean, one thing that's really interesting about growth and early childhood development more generally is it's not like this sort of simple linear process, as anyone who's had a child or spent lots of time with a young child will realize. It comes in these sort of stages and spurts, and that messes with all sorts of things like sleep, so we tend to notice it. But it's not a linear process. What you'll find is that those processes of development will have real kind of rapid sprints. So kids will start acquiring a whole new set of skills, whether that's, and we talk about different domains. So we talk about things like the ability to communicate and communication, and we talk about the social emotional interaction. We talk about fine motor and can they pick up and we get, we've probably, many of us come across these quite crude little screening tests of, can your child pick up a pea? And that's their pincer grip. Can they stand up? Can they walk? Can they jump? Jumping's a bit of a harder one. Hopping, quite a tricky skill. There's always things as different bits of our brain are developing. So yes, they do, but it's not a sort of straightforward linear process.
Okay, that's really interesting. And so sometimes I suppose you could think about like children being just mini adults. And I think sometimes we do, but actually different things are going on for them clearly, at different stages of development. So can you give some sort of examples of how like a children's brain and body will differ to an adult and how that kind of impacts their learning and development?
Yeah, I think the main thing I would say to that is that our brains are all plastic to a degree. We can learn new things. We can change how we think about things. We can pick up a new skill, and even later life, you can teach old dogs new tricks. But it's much easier to teach young dogs new tricks. And so there's I'd say that's the biggest difference between early childhood, is that our brains are exquisitely sensitive to the environments that we're in. And that can be both positive, so that positive interaction and the kind of nurturing care is the term we talk about of what you need in early years. It's sort of a slightly academic way of talking about like love, I think, like love and care and attention. But we're exquisitely responsive to those environments, and we're also incredibly vulnerable to insults or adversity. And so there's this concept of adverse childhood experiences. So that adversity in the early years can really undermine our brain development in a way that, of course, adversity is horrible in adulthood, in teenage years, in later life. It's not good at either, but the consequences are less long lasting. And we can see that from really, really powerful examples of studies. There's famously been an incredibly long set of research around some of the sort of post-Soviet Union orphanages in Romania. There's something called the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. And in that work, some really impressive science was done to actually try and understand, this horrible, not an experiment, this thing happened. Some kids were in really quite extreme deprivation, and some kids were in that deprivation for longer. And there was an opportunity to actually try and understand what that did to those kids' brains and their lives and their livelihoods and their learning and earning and happiness. And really what that showed is that the earlier that you got adopted, this was around adoption now, the earlier you got adopted out of an institutional setting like that, the better you did. And really, if you were later, that was harder to make up for those sort of insults, as it were. So early years, incredible vulnerability, but also incredible opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's really interesting. And like, so as a parent, obviously, and a mum, I'm straight to the guilt. So what things do I need to avoid?
I love the guilt.
I know.
Too much parental guilt.
It's too much. I need to let go of it. So
I had this idea of a parenting book called The Good Enough Parent, but apparently there is one already.
Oh,
I think
I need
good
to
enough.
read it. Oh, yeah. So I was just wondering, so do you have any, just whilst we touched on the adverse childhood experiences, I mean, I think, like, so having a little bit of experience with charities, like you do see that stuff, and obviously you see it more because that's why people are seeking help. But just as a sort of day-to-day parent, you know, I mean, life happens, doesn't it? And some negative things might come in. Are there any kind of key things that we can do to sort of protect our children from that if we're aware?
Yeah, I think there's two ways to think about it. One is on a sort of societal level, and that's a bit where we're thinking about this with Tandem. You know, we're trying to build technology that is encouraging what children really need in the early years to happen. The way I think about early years is there's really complicated sort of neuroimaging science and observational epidemiology and things, but it can be we can simplify it quite a lot. I like the snakes and ladders analogy for early childhood. There's ladders that help you kind of develop well, get ahead, reach your potential, and then there's snakes that drag you down again. And to me, the good early childhood development policy and programs and interventions and technology will be the technology that is the ladders, not the snakes. So just to unpack that a little bit more, things that are really good in early childhood, just to make it really simple, don't be sick. You know, if you can avoid it, don't be sick. So think about preventative healthcare. So things like having your vaccinations, having kind of some growth monitoring to check if there's anything not going right, having curative healthcare if you're sick. Real basic stuff, but for a lot of the world that doesn't happen. You know, we miss that opportunity. So don't be sick, have enough to eat and enough quality food to eat. So that's another big ladder in early childhood is getting a diverse diet, having enough of the different nutrient groups that you need, making sure that you've got access to that sort of all year round, not just seasonally. So don't be sick, get enough to eat. And then the third one, and this is the one that gets missed, is the interaction. It's all about interaction in the early years. There's very famous, and you know, haven't always aged that well, studies around, they talk about the 30 million word gap in the US around the difference between high-income families and low-income families. And the high-income family kids, on average, would have heard 30 million more words by the time they start school than the low-income families. Now, the science there's complicated, and this was before anyone did really good tracking, so a pinch of salt, but the principle's totally spot on. The more interaction you have in the early years, adult-child interaction, the better for your child. So that's playing, singing, laughing, giggling, talking, reading. And you know, maybe to come back to technology briefly, that's what we're trying to do with Tandem a bit. We're trying to say, well, actually, and actually the reason we're building Tandem is that we don't think enough technology at the moment is doing that ladder for young children. Actually, it's possibly a snake that's dragging them down. It's technology that is a sort of digital dummy that takes a child, distracts and occupies and really keeps them busy. And you know, there's reasons why we need to keep our kids busy. There's no, like I said, no place for guilt on this. But it's not necessarily giving that kid what they really need. Mm-hmm. And what we want to try and see existing, and hopefully we can be one of the people to build it, is technology that actually gets that ladder of interaction happening more. So that's about helping, finding the opportunities to play, to have things like shared attention. So it's that moment where you're both looking at, it could be a Lego brick on the floor or a piece of washing that you're picking up or whatever, something that you're doing together and playing. Mm-hmm. That's the sort of magic secret sauce of like good early childhood, I think.
Oh, that's interesting. And so something that's come to my mind on that as well, because another term that I've heard, like as a mum, is things around attachment theory and like how attachments are also crucial. Does that kind of interplay with that interaction aspect? Is it in the same
Yeah,
ballpark?
absolutely. And it's there's sort of, again, quite a rich sort of history of sort of learning around how those very earliest relationships that we form with often with our parents, particularly mothers, particularly where you have, for example, breastfeeding, you're close, frequently, regular contact. But also you don't have to be breastfeeding. It's just that's one of the opportunities you might have to have very close interaction, close connection, close bonding. What we sort of see is that the stronger attachments in those early years can help to lay strong foundations, really. Can lay strong foundations for your later life relationship forming and kind of learning and then what you're earning as well. And I think I'm slightly hesitated because there was a little bit of a debate around how kind of Western is that as a concept. And to me, I think there are differences in different cultures around what primary caregivers are there, what the role of different caregivers is. And I don't think there's sort of a one size fits all. But to me, stepping one level back and saying actually positive interaction with lots of joy and laughter and fun is good. And it's actually really good for parents too. The sort of interaction we're talking about is the stuff that leaves you feeling warm inside and your little baby feeling warm inside, or your toddler, or your preschool. Okay,
that's really good. Just to unpick that, I think, actually, because you hear a lot about both, certainly in the Western world.
Yeah.
So that's interesting to know. So sort of going back in terms of early childhood development, and we touched on this briefly, but what are the sort of core building blocks and how do they lay the foundation? So, maybe things like language and social emotional skills. Things like that.
You've kind of captured it. I think there's different ways of thinking about it. You can think about it in terms of the sort of different domains of development. So we tend to talk about things like language, social emotional development, gross motor, fine motor, and sort of more broader sort of cognition as different sort of buckets of things that we might measure in child development. But I tend to keep it quite simple. I think of it as sort of the things that the building blocks are to me. It's that don't be sick, have enough to eat, and get the interaction and form those relationships that set you up.
Okay, keeps it simple. I like it. So, what of that then? What are some of the biggest misconceptions that people might have around early childhood development, do you think?
Oh, that's a big question. I think sometimes people spend time arguing about when is early childhood. We touched on that at the beginning, but I think it doesn't, to me, it's like we can obsess on that too much. I think the principle is early is early is better. So think about the really early years, but also don't forget about that whole transition through childhood and later life as well. I think one of the biggest misconceptions in kind of global policy has been a really over focus on the things we can measure more easily. So there's been a misconception around kind of linear growth at all costs, and actually we do care about stunting because it does associate with less well-developed brains, but actually we don't care if we're short at all. We care about if we're reaching our potential, and that's mostly about our brains. So I think there's a misconception around sort of oversimplifying it away from thinking around our brains and thinking around just our physical bodies. I don't know, what do you think? There's probably a load that parents have that I don't know. I think we all have different misconceptions.
Yeah, we do. I suppose that's why I thought about attachment a little bit, I think, because it gets thrown in. I think the simplification of there's different pressures in different families, aren't there? I think some people are able to, take quite a long time off work, some mums or parents, or share leave. Sometimes that's just not possible with work and things that you have to do, or family situation. So, yeah, I think I'm kind of interested in things that are going to support my child, my child's a bit older now, but that kind of development that don't kind of add this layer of guilt. I keep talking about it. It's such a thing. It really is a thing. And I just feel, actually the misconceptions, about, you hear lots, I suppose, there's different camps, aren't there, around the kind of attachment and what that means, and then versus actually say breaking it down, because I think based on what you're saying, that actually if a child is getting those interactions, whether that's from grandmas and granddads, or a close caregiver, a really good kind of nursery situation as well, or like whatever that, or childminder, you know, and also parents, all of it, everybody plays their part in it. So it's not just actually down to kind of mum.
Yeah, it's that,
for
that
example, because that's often what happens.
It's that old phrase of it takes a village to raise a child. I mean, you know, the societies we live in are different, and there's different forms of those, and there's different recipes for a brilliant childhood. I think that would be that's an important one to sort of, there's no one size fits all on this. And actually diversity is a real strength in early childhood. And yeah, I don't know. I think there's one other thing I think is interesting that's a misconception is sometimes people sort of think that, oh, I don't need to talk to my baby until the baby's talking back. And that's the thing that we see in lots of different societies, and maybe more with dads. I think we see that dads have maybe had less role modelling of their dads necessarily sort of playing and being silly, and there's really interesting literature around the involvement of male caregivers in the early years and how important it is, but it's not always it's changed a lot over our lifetimes, really changed. Myself and your husband are much more likely to spend significantly more time with our children than our parents would have done, or our parents' parents would have done. And that's a really big shift. And it's happening fairly globally, actually. So there's sort of interesting conceptions around whose role it is. On a societal level, I think there's a really big problem that we just ignore early years. And that's not quite a misconception, but it's just an underappreciation. Yeah. We spend loads of money and effort on sort of not loads, probably not enough actually, but we spend some effort having a health system, having some antenatal sort of support, having support for delivery, and then maybe we do a bit after birth on the first month and a few vaccines, but then we largely leave children to it until they get to school age. Not completely, but the amount of resource we put in the early years is way lower. And actually that's also reflected in where the technology industry has the same blind spot. The technology industry doesn't really think about early childhood, doesn't think about how important young children's interactions with technology are likely to be for all the reasons we've talked about. And that's got to change. Yeah. Especially as this technology becomes much more scary, powerful, wonderful, utterly terrifying, you know.
I think on every level, isn't it? It's just actually thinking about just not kind of skipping that point, really. You know, I think sort of one of the things I remember hearing about, actually, a friend sent to me, just because of my interest around children's charity work, was that I think there's a charity in the UK that actually focused on those early years around nutrition. You mentioned it earlier, but they saw some incredible results because they'd actually focused on that right point. And I get that now from this conversation. I understand why, because you look at it and you think that's incredible. Yeah. So I think actually, as you said, like both from, you know, whether it's what we're eating or how we're interacting or how technology is affecting children in those years, I think it's like embracing how we improve that rather than just kind of ignoring it.
Totally. So, and it's really interesting how and why we ignore the early years. It's something that I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about in very different contexts of work in Pakistan and in Yemen, in Zambia, in the UK. And it's quite often quite similar things, actually. A lot of it, I think, comes down to sort of traditional views of the role of society and also gender roles. We sort of think of those early years as being the mother's responsibility or maybe the family's responsibility, and the state kind of keeps out of them. And there's some reasons why that makes perfect sense. I mean, I'm not sort of, you know, you can have different views about where you want the state to intervene. But it's sort of interesting that we want the state to spend lots of effort on higher education and secondary schools and primary schools, but not the early years. I think there's a bit of a mismatch there. And that's why there's, you know, that isn't backed up by the economics here. The economics of early intervention versus later intervention are really clear. There's a very famous graph called the Heckman equation, which basically says the earlier you invest in the next generation, the bigger your returns on that investment. So if a pound spent in the early years is going to return £13, I think is the sort of generally stated figure of return on investment through things like kids learning more, kids then being able to get higher earning jobs. Also other things like lower rates of criminal behaviour and incarceration. And so there's a whole set of sort of antisocial behaviour co-benefits as well to thinking about those early years. but yet we see hardly any resources. And then you see, as you go through the age, of course, there's a return on investment for most education type investments, but it goes down as you get older. So, yeah.
That's really interesting. We should campaign for more in the
Absolutely.
Certainly all of us. So just a sort of, I have some other questions actually. I'm interested in technology, but before we get on to that, I was just wondering, kind of just, for parents, if you're listening to this and you're thinking like, okay, that's great. Like, it's really interesting to know all that. But what are some just really simple kind of everyday activities that parents can do to kind of improve it? Like, what should I focus on? Like, I only have so much time, maybe I'm out working, I get back, and what can I do?
Yeah, I think we're going to probably have a whole podcast on some of these what can I do things, but I think what I won't try and do is do a really bad version of like a whole parenting podcast of like how to do parenting, partly because I think I'm still got my learner badges on, 3 kids in. But I would say thinking specifically around sort of what you can do in early years and technology is, I think about it is the main thing I would say. Think about, just start by thinking about, where is technology influencing my young child's life? Where are we coming into contact with it? And to me, is that a thing that is a solo activity, or is that a shared activity? And I'm not saying never put your kids in front of a screen. I think that there's the world as we'd like it, and there's the world as it is. And actually, quite often you might need a bit of time to cook that nutritious meal that you want to give your child, or to empty the washing machine so they have something to wear. There's a life thing where you might want to do it. But if those activities that are solo interactions with technology can connect to something you do together, then that's a really important thing. Equally, if there's ways that technology can be a thing you do together, whether it's reading together or co-watching, I think is really different to sitting and watching on your own. That's probably a better use of technology in the early years. And more generally, I think it's about stuff like reading together, finding moments to have kind of any catalyst for that interaction, anything you can do together. It might be a pack of cards you can play with and throw on the floor. It might be a pots and pans in the kitchen that you can make some music with. It might be a book you can read at bedtime. Those are all just like, I think those are sort of super parent activities. So do more of those. Find that short amount of time to have that each day, and it'll probably make you feel better. And actually thinking about what we're trying to do at Tandem, we're trying to help make those things a bit easier. Sometimes you have full of ideas and you've maybe been like, seen some video reel of some brilliant idea and you happen to be in exactly the same sort of context, and you might feel like that's really easy to do. But sometimes we all need a bit of inspiration and a bit of help and a bit of nudges to try and do those things. So yeah. That's my sort of top tips.
It can be hard.
But I don't know. What do you think? I don't know.
Well, I don't know. So I kind of something that I've learnt more of since kind of being with Tandem. I'm probably aware of it as a parent, but I can't. Can only take so much on board. I think. Certainly for me, I was generally very sleep deprived, so I don't remember most of it.
Yeah.
But
you're not the only one.
I don't think most people are. So yeah, that's a challenge to layer on top of it. But I think the bit around sort of, even though they maybe aren't talking, but creating a conversation, so there's the kind of reading a book, but then actually, just pretending you have a conversation with them, for me, it's a little bit like, maybe, I'm not comparing to children's dogs at all, but, people do it with their dogs. They're like, aren't you having a nice day? And I think we should do that with children. Yeah. Actually, they might not be responding, or they might just blow a raspberry, but it's
and they are responding.
Conversation. Yeah.
They might not be responding in the same way, but there'll be little cues. And I think that's one of the things that when you see brilliant kind of health visitors at work and talking about their work, what they're often trying to do is to help us to tune into our babies and toddlers. And actually, when we've got a toddler when we've said, oh, look, there's a rainbow, and the toddler's sort of eyes have gone to it, to sort of just notice that, and then you're having that magic moment. So I think you're right. I think it's feeling confident to be, and sometimes to be a bit silly. That's my other thing. That's one of the things I like most about being with my kids, is that I get a sort of license to be silly.
It's an excuse. I also think actually that's a brilliant role that dads can play. Yeah. Because I think it depends on who. Because obviously we have dads that stay at home, we have mums that stay at home, and I think sometimes if you're the first point caregiver, whichever
Yeah.
person that is, it doesn't matter. But I think it can genuinely be quite exhausting. I do remember just
relentless.
being like,
Absolutely
just take him for a bit.
Yeah.
But I think then there's that, thinking about if you're doing the opposite role, I think coming in with that energy and being silly and doing those things that maybe actually if you're not the one that's kind of suffering as much or tired as much for some reason, and it
might help recharge you as well. And you then can come back and be silly too if you've been all day
at work or something, whatever it might be. Yeah, no, I think that's really good. The other thing that I think about a little bit, and I kind of learned as I went, I definitely didn't get this right to start with, but I remember seeing something a little bit around, so obviously there's the technology that we showed to children, but then there's the phone in my pocket as a grown-up. And I think, I can't remember who it was, but I remember somebody saying, like, you need to sometimes think about your phone as a person.
Yeah.
So I kind of, and it would be interesting actually just to sort of ask you about this. So, I mean, from my point of view, when I was working, I would get emails, I'd do stuff. There's things I would need to kind of respond to on my phone, or you feel like you need to. But I think it's being mindful of just not like constantly looking at something else, because it's like just imagining I'm constantly looking at another person, I'm not looking at my child. And so for me, I think it was like that, like quality maybe over quantity, because there was life and I had a job and I had to kind of deal with stuff. But then actually, like, if I was with my little boy, it's like actually focusing and paying attention and trying to kind of put it on silent, hide it.
And probably having a different room. I mean, I'm terrible at this, so it's very much a work in progress in that. But I think everything we are doing, I mean, this amazing ability that young kids have to learn. They are, every day is a school day for them, in that they are learning from everything we do. They're learning from everything they observe in the world. And so how we interact with technology ourselves is going to probably start laying the foundations for how they think about technology. And I feel very uncomfortable with when you, I think I told you the story, we were out on Christmas Day and walked past someone in a buggy. And I think the dad was on his phone and the child was on their phone. And this was a Christmas Day morning, we were out for a walk, and there was probably a 3 or 4 year old and they were both in their own human machine interactions, not any human interactions. And it was a sort of modelling of reciprocal behaviour. One was doing the same as the other. And I think we probably all need to think a bit. Yeah. And again, it's funny when we've set up a technology company, but I'm like equal parts, like technology can be the hero and the villain here. And it may be even more that it's the villain, and we just need to try and build the hero piece. Because technology can get between that early interaction. And I think our hope is, can we actually, it's going to be hard to remove, even if we wanted to. We probably wouldn't want to, because there's lots of good things technology gives us, whether it's like catching the right bus or not getting lost or being able to phone when we need to talk to a family member or connect. But even if we did want to get rid of technology, we probably aren't going to. So what we need to do is to find better ways to use technology, that it does bring us together, not move us apart.
And on that, can you just talk a little bit about how we think we could use technology to further enhance that kind of support for parents and also children's development?
Yeah, in terms of what we're doing at Tandem. Yeah, I mean, we've always tried to make it's not an advertorial podcast, but we will. But I think what we're trying to do, I mean, we would love other people to do it too. So it's more of a like call to action than an advert. But the name Tandem is not a coincidence. As you know, what we're trying to do is to say, well, whether it's a tandem kayak or a bike, you're doing something together. The point of Tandem is, can we build technology that is a catalyst for that interaction? And I think the sort of things that are really interesting about what we're trying to do is to think about the device not as a focus. And actually, maybe in a few years, I think it's quite likely we won't even be looking at phones as the medium. It might be its smart speakers or some other technology that's not quite yet in the mainstream. But really, can that device be something that just helps you to have those interactions? So we're starting with shared reading because it's the behaviour that we know. We kind of all know, you should read to your kids. It's one of the things that we get hammered, and sometimes enough that we feel guilty about not doing it as much. But we do it. We know most of us know that we should read together. And what we're trying to do is say, well, actually, can we overcome some of the sort of reading battles that you might get on the child side by allowing them to use some very safe, very contained AI to generate a story that they want to read, and where we're moving next is to create an activity that they want to do. that fits with what they're interested in. If they're interested in dinosaurs, they can create a dinosaur village out of whatever, a dinosaur mountain jungle. So create something the kid wants to do, but also just make it a little bit easier for the parent, recognizing their life. They're probably busy. Most parents are. They may be full of ideas and they may have a ton of books on their shelf and they may have a million parenting and role models around them, or they might not. And so for those parents, can we actually give them some helpful nudges? And then I think the other piece that we're trying to do is to sort of track that in a very transparent, very clear what data we're collecting and why, but track that in a way that we can give you coaching, a bit of support, and a bit of like a Fitbit for your reading. We're going to have a Fitbit for that interaction, sort of Fitbit for fun, and then play that back to you and say, no, never. There's no guilt here. We're not going to do the Duolingo sort of passive aggressive thing, but just positive messaging that says that's really good. This is why this is good. Yeah. So our hypothesis is that there's a bunch of things that get between us maybe doing what we sort of know we want to do, or maybe don't even know we want to do. And can we try and take some of those out of the equation and do that in a way that makes it easier to kind of be the parent you want to be, really?
Absolutely, I understand that. I mean, I've kind of used it, and obviously, again, it's not just a plug for Tandem, but I think what's kind of interesting about that for me is it's like, you know, as a parent, because of the way the world is, I always have my phone in my pocket, apart from when I've lost it, which is frequently. But, you know, actually, it's nice to feel now that because I have got Tandem, it's like I've got something that's a go-to that, like, I can, like, create an interaction. You know, if there's a moment where it's like, oh, there's a bit of, you know, I mean, children should be bored as well, but like that, you know, you maybe need to occupy them, or you want to do something together,
hungry,
but you're
waiting for the food.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're waiting for food. Great example. Then, you know, it's something that isn't just a passive thing to give, because actually, you know, then it creates a really positive thing out of that moment, rather than the kind of, you know, Mommy, can I have your phone? I'm like, no.
Yeah. Well, it's a really different thing, isn't it?
And it's
Let's
like,
do something together versus can I have your phone?
Yes,
it's
exactly. It's like, can I have your phone? No, I don't want you to have my phone.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, but I'm bored. I'm like, okay, well, one, obviously, some situations I'm like, we'll go figure that out because he's older, you know, so that's a fair enough thing to say, less so with younger children. But, you know, then I can actually say, well, let's make a story, let's do something together. And I think it's just, it is a sort of handy tool. So
I hope so. It's work in progress, but I think that's what we want to try and create.
Okay, so should we do some quick fire questions?
Go on then, that's fine.
So I think we've almost covered it, but let's go for it. Yes or no only, or maybe a sentence if you're allowed. Right. Is it true that a child's brain develops more rapidly in the first 5 years than at any other time?
Easy, yes.
Now, this is maybe a tricky one. Are early social emotional skills more important? I'm going to start again. Are early social emotional skills more important than early academic skills?
Ooh, good question. I actually think this one's easier now in the way the world is and the way technology is than it would have been even a year ago. And I actually think, and I wrote a thing, we wrote a thing in a paper that we published that basically said, in a world that is getting hotter, getting more crowded, and that we're sharing with really intelligent robots, it's never been more important for us to know how to get along. Like, very basic level. Very basic, we managed to write a few thousand words on it, but the basic, that's the basic point. So I actually think that social emotional, that interaction is, and learning how to get along is the key thing. And actually sorry, I'm going over a sentence. That is reflected in the Royal Foundation's recent really great work around the Shaping Us campaign, where they've really tried to explore what that looks like, and we'll put a little link to that in the show notes. So yes, learn how to get along.
Good answer.
Not quick,
so can early experiences literally shape a child's brain?
Oh, it's like that. I hadn't seen these before, but yes, absolutely. They literally can. And actually, I'll add one line. We can see that now on neuroimaging. So we can see the difference in neuroimaging between kids who've done lots of early reading and interaction and kids who've had more kind of poverty in their linguistic environment, so had less linguistic interaction. You can see different functional MRI changes in the brain.
Amazing. And so does play have a critical role in early childhood development?
Absolutely fundamental, yes. I'm on this really brilliant play commission that's been set up by the former Children's Commissioner and Paul Lindley, who founded LSHTM and has done brilliant champion of children's rights and the role of children's society. And it's all about getting play back out of the like nice to have box and putting it squarely on the top of the agenda for the government and for society more generally. So yes, it's all about play.
And
that wasn't very quick.
No. Okay, so can you give me like one top tip for a parent on like playing with their early years child?
It doesn't need toys, and it can be done anywhere. Playing can be a thing that you, that's terrible, it's not really a good tip. Just do more of it, be more playful. And like I think, I'm getting there in the end. I think your kids give you a license to be more playful, so don't waste it.
Okay, that's a good tip.
Yeah.
So in reality then, I'm just thinking as mum, so that might be like, I don't know, playing peekaboo or what else? I don't know, just other games. Can you spot something? All sorts of just anything.
Peekaboo's like Casper, one of our team, has written this amazing book about why babies laugh at peekaboo, and it's brilliant from all good bookshops. But has also done lots of research in the baby lab to actually show why that's such an exciting game to play with kids, and it is quite fun. So yes, do more peekaboo.
It's easy and it's endless. That's good. So can consistent loving interactions from parents significantly impact a child's future success?
Yes, easy. Talk a bit about that. So
yeah. Is it possible for parents to undo some negative early experiences?
Yes. Yes, but it's harder than preventing them to happen in the first place. It's the basic principle. Like in almost everything, prevention is better than sort of cure. So yes, if you've had a really tough early years and there's a big change in your life for the better, whether that might be moving, migrating or adopting, we've got good science that shows that you can do really well. But it's quite a lot harder than actually preventing some of those insults.
Okay. And so do parents need to be experts in child development to make a positive impact?
Well, I don't know, it depends what you mean by an expert. I sort of think all parents, or almost all parents, can be experts in that they, as long as we kind of don't academize, don't overcomplicate really what being an expert in our parenting is. To me, it's those basics. It's just understanding that those years matter, that your interactions together matter, that every little thing you're doing together in those early years it's the equivalent of people think, I'll save money for their university fund. Spend it on Lego or Tandem or playing together or just time together, because that's really important too. And so we can all be experts in the early years.
That's good. And I do wonder if it's about, there's other things in life really where you think about whether it's sort of noticing, sort of being interested and actually being curious around your child rather than just making assumptions.
Yeah.
I mean,
and actually I think we've mentioned a few times around this sort of idea of feeling a bit guilty. And sort of feeling guilty is sort of a bit of a barrier sometimes to that space where you're sort of noticing and enjoying the moment. And if you're constantly feeling guilty and constantly thinking, I've got to do more, I've got to find, that's not going to help, is it? So less guilt.
Less guilt.
Yeah.
I agree. That seems to work. I think it is, and that's why I mentioned the expertise, because I suppose, maybe in situations now where we're not bringing up children within a village or within a family structure because you don't have people around you, I think if you want to try and do your best, you feel like you've got to learn it all and be that expert. But then I think actually, as you say rightly, that kind of guilt comes with it because you suddenly start thinking about all the things you are and aren't doing, when actually, like I said, just being there, being curious, being interested, having fun, play is just absolutely key. That's good. And so can everyday moments like reading and talking to your child make a difference?
Yes. Easy one. But, I think what's the caveat to that is that, yes, but actually we're seeing there's a decline in early reading. And there's many people, the Children's Laureate in the UK has been pointing this out. National Literacy Trust has done lots of work on this and tracking it. And we are seeing a sort of concurrent decline in early shared reading and some increasing in technology use. And I'm not saying they're connected, but I think it certainly is possible that they're connected. It probably is, as far as to say it's likely. So yes, it does matter. We need to do more of it.
And so if, as a parent, I'm kind of busy and thinking, what can I do? It really is something to prioritise.
Yeah. I don't think it's never wasted time together.
No. Okay. Well, that's the end of my questions for now. Unless
Brilliant.
there's anything else you want to add, Rob, of sort of thoughts that we've had, thinking about what we've spoken about today.
I don't think so. I mean, I think maybe we just sort of wrap up. I mean, I think if I was to think of like the key message I would say to anyone around kind of the science of early child development is that we're quite unusual as humans, actually. We have babies that are incredibly needy. We were talking about this a while before, but if you're a wildebeest growing up on the Masai Mara, your baby has to be able to sort of stand up within a few seconds or minutes and outrun a hyena pretty quickly. And there's a spectrum across species that goes from those that are incredibly capable juveniles to those that have incredibly needy juveniles. And actually we have the needy juveniles. And that's why we have these big brains, and we grow these big brains that allow us to have all these philosophical conversations and build wonderful things that the world's full of now. But that means it comes with a set of kind of responsibilities. So yeah, I think the early years are vital. They lay the foundations, and we should spend more time thinking about them in all ways, but especially thinking about the role of technology in the early years. So with that, let's wrap up this episode of Tech Tots. We're going to have a couple of episodes coming where we're going to do a couple of expert interviews to sort of build on this conversation. And we've got a whole load more episodes in the pipeline. So please do sign up to whatever podcast platform, subscribe, share it with your friends, and reply as well, and send us in comments. We're such a new small podcast that I promise we will reply to every single comment or question we get.
Yeah.
We probably, once we're massive, won't be able to say that.
Yeah, we'd love to
For
hear
now,
from
we
you.
can. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah.
So with that, it's over and out from me.
And goodbye from me as well.